Mike Mears, welcome to Partnering Leadership. I am thrilled to have you in this conversation with me.
Mahan, I'm delighted to get the chance to talk to you today.
Mike, can't wait to talk about certainty, how great bosses can change minds and drive innovation. And I love the fact that you're right here in DMV District, Maryland, Virginia, our beautiful region, nation's capital. I tell people it is the most magnificent place in the world, but we won't spend too much time talking about that. I want to first get to know you a little bit better. Whereabouts did you grow up, Mike, and how has your upbringing contributed to who you've become?
Guess you've heard the expression blessings in disguise. I grew up in Newport News, Virginia, and I had three blessings, I suppose. One of them was I grew up lower middle class and probably on the lower end of that. And now, why is that a blessing? Of course, it depends on the person's basic personality, but what it really gave me a sense of a drive to do good in the world or to attain something and to help other people and so forth. The beauty of my upbringing, my parents never restricted that. It was, you may be whatever you resolve to be, basically, upbringing. And that's great. What a gift that was. Then a second one was the fact that I was an only child. And I can hear some listeners right now saying, oh, I married a woman who was the oldest of 12. Now, you got to try to hold that marriage together. Only child with the oldest of 12. But what that gave me was an ability to deal with solitude and an ability to reflect. And years later, I found out that was a gift. And then the third thing was, this will horrify parents today, but back then, this was 1950s, my upbringing was completely free range, where Saturday mornings, I'd hop on a bike. I'd ride 10 years old. I'd ride 3 miles through busy streets to get to the James River, play all day. And the only rule was I had to be back by dark. My neuroscience friends tell me that helps me today in my decision making and in creativity, having that kind of a free range type play. So there you have it. Three blessings in disguise.
Those are three blessings. I'm a big fan of Jonathan Haidt's work, including The Coddling of American Mind. And Jonathan Haidt talks about some of the challenges we are having, specifically because as parents, we have controlled the movement and every aspect of the lives of our young people. Now, I wonder what brought you to the CIA for a big portion of your career, Mike, and then end up in human resources, which might sound odd to people on the outside who are not familiar with the agency.
So what I can say is I was in the Directorate of Operations, and that is the spy side of the house. And I operated in that directorate for many years and someday you and I'll have a beer together and I can tell you more stories when it's not taped, but some hair-raising stories there. And then I worked for Jack Welch for a number of years during the 90s when GE was in its heyday. And we talk about that his style doesn't work today, but there's some really brilliant things he did to manage that organization. And then I joined up at the CIA in an overt position, not covert, but overt. So that's why I can tell you that, yes, I worked at CIA. I don't have to say I work somewhere else or whatever. And it was a fascinating time to have the experience from, I'd been in small business doing startups. I'd worked for big business with GE. I had worked in government organizations, and so you really get a good feel for culture and all that good stuff. So what really knocked me, or what got me started into the leadership thing, was the director of operations, deputy director of operations. I got a call one day and I went rushing up to his office, first trying to find out from the caller, could you tell me what this is about? Because you get that little spike of fear. What have I done now? Why am I getting called up there? We've all had that. So I went running up there and he asked me a question, which I have thought about. This was more than 20 years ago. And I've thought about this question every day since. And it was simply looked up at me and said, Mike, why is it when I pull the levers, nothing happens? And the interesting, and I knew what he meant because we'd had many discussions. The levers are the old line metric system to guide people and the reward system to pay them bonuses to do such and such, training system, all that good stuff, communications. And here's a guy in one of the most powerful positions in the world, and he feels stymied. And why the question burned into my head is my title at the time, it doesn't exist anymore, was the senior counselor for leadership and management. So I was the guru. Everybody would come to me and I could give them answers. And I couldn't answer the basic question of why aren't things working around here? And I've gotten that question from high level executives ever since when they let their hair down a little bit. And just last week, I had an executive at a very large, a senior executive at the large financial firm asked me the question, why can't I get my organization to adopt AI? That's the same question as the levers don't work, right? It's all part and parcel. So anyway, that's what drives me. And when you start thinking that way, every time you see a psychological study or you hear somebody overhear a conversation, you're plugging it back into that question. And it's absolutely fascinating how the brain will expand and pick up all these little pieces and come up with solutions.
I absolutely love that question for so many reasons, Mike. I don't think there is a week that goes by when I don't hear a version of that question, whether it is with return to office, that
Yeah.
all kinds of
Oh,
companies
there you go. Right.
are all kinds of CEOs throwing fits why they can't get their people to come back to the office 5 days a week when they tell them to. So those levers that a lot of leaders in organizations have been used to pulling and getting things done don't work. So now the question is, how come? When did these levers stop working?
It's interesting. Let's take performance management. GE actually was a foundation management, actually was a foundational company in the early 1900s, starting that whole concept, right? And it does make sense, very logical, right? And so they carried that through until the time when I was working for Welch. I remember you recall this, they would chop off the bottom 10% every year, which is only why I only worked there 8 3/4 years. I figured my time has probably come now. Right. But what they had was a type A personality, executive and management cadre. It was a lot of pressure and stress, and the use of the old performance management system, which, if you think about it, was pretty heartless in that you had no idea where you stood for a year, and then you get your annual review. When we talk about this concept of certainty and uncertainty, that's probably the cruelest thing you could do to people is to hold them in uncertainty if you don't need to. And so it's good for him, realized that and actually changed the system and killed that annual review off. And what he did was he set in a system where managers and employees would talk along the way. It's not Adobe's check-ins, but that's the seed of that really great idea. And I'm telling you, just personally in my life, oh my God, it was so much better to know where you stand with the boss than being uncertain of how am I doing, boss? Am I fitting into the big picture and so forth? It's that system has still stuck. We still are industrial age, and one of my favorite guys was a fellow named Douglas McGregor, who wrote a book back in 1959 and 60. He was an MIT prof, and he wrote a book called The Human Side of Enterprise, and he came up with this theory X, theory Y. And theory X is you need a lot of accountability and punitive measures because you can't trust people. And theory Y is, boy, what would happen if we pulled out the best of human nature? We're still somewhat stuck on that theory X, theory Y question.
We are, Mike. I want to highlight a couple of points that you made. First of all, with all his flaws, and we can spend the rest of the conversation focused on Jack Welch, what he did right and what he did wrong. He did adjust that approach at GE. A lot of people still think about that, but he changed it while he was CEO. Now, fast forward though, a few months back, Mark Zuckerberg did exactly the same thing. And he announced it, which by itself can sound cruel for anyone who had been laid off from Facebook at that time. But that struggle still continues. It's not as if we've moved beyond it.
I think you had Anders Inset.
Yes.
You had a chat with him, and it was really interesting because he was talking around an issue that I see out there. And it is, I believe that there is a massive executive cognitive bias, what we call it, the executive extrinsic bias, which is sometimes people have called the tangibility bias, but it's not backed by psychology. But what it is, the idea is your mind will go to the tangible versus the intangible. And the way I would express it is I see this every day, is our minds, we'll give lip service to, or we'll say that we got to get the mission done, but we got to take care of our people. The trouble is we're giving lip service to the people side, the soft side. And then what do? We gravitate to the hard side. So for example, we conduct our budget reviews quarterly, if not monthly. How many people have leadership reviews? None. And there, I really believe that there is an innate bias that all of us carry around. And we do know, by the way, there's that one called the extrinsic incentives bias, which if you ask a group of frontline managers, what motivates your employees, they'll say money. And then you ask the employees, what motivates you? And they say recognition. Now, it doesn't mean that we don't all want money. They rank money as number 6. But I did that experiment 3 times in CIA, and I got those same results. So isn't it interesting how we know culture's important, we know people are important, but we keep flopping back over to process and procedures and structure?
We do. So why is that? I know you've studied the brain, human thinking. Why is it that when you talk to me, Mike, it all makes perfect sense? And for the audience, they're listening, they've heard it before, it makes perfect sense. But when it comes to actually behaving differently, that leadership behavior and those actions haven't shifted.
The answer to the spy master's question is not just unsatisfactory, but the answer is, why don't the levers work? Boss, it's human nature. The levers work against human nature or only partially with human nature. You got to reverse engineer human nature. That's what we spies do, by the way. We have to know what makes people tick, and it can be life-threatening situations if you don't play your cards.
Let me clarify something here, Mike. It's not that the levers worked before and something has changed and therefore the levers don't work. You were saying that the levers never really worked because they were set against basic rules of human nature and human thinking and the way our brains operate.
Absolutely. And I'd go back even farther. You think about, I want to read a book with the title of Hierarchy, History of Hierarchy. Nobody's written this book. But anyway, if you go back in time, who invented hierarchy? And pre-Egyptian. And what a brilliant idea of, you had basically anarchy or gangs, basically. And then somebody said, hey, Azebo, you go over there and cut those blocks. And America, you tie those horses and put rollers under and get up. And they actually formed hierarchy. And that was a huge leap forward to what was before. By the time we got to the industrial age, I think those levers were a giant leap forward. And there's a fun website. If you go to the Smithsonian website, they have a whole bunch of historic videos. The first video ever taken of a workplace was 1904, and it was a company called Westinghouse Air Brake. Now, Westinghouse Air Brake was the company of that era. You won't believe this, they gave workers half a day Saturday off. Can you imagine that? And they installed showers. There were postcards of that company that people would pass around. And anyway, Edison and Westinghouse hated each other, but there was a truce, and to get the high intensity bulb from Westinghouse, so Edison had movies, he came in and filmed the workplace. But you look, there's 30 some films, and it really goes back to show you what we think today was a pretty hideous existence. But back then, that was a giant leap forward from what they'd had before. And I think that what Welch did is he did take an old industrial age company like that. And after 20 some years of grinding, he was able to change the culture. And it really was with his workout, which is I call quick wins. And with Six Sigma, he engaged the brains of his employees. And I think that was unprecedented. And you got a quick story for you, Welch story, okay? This was going around when I was at GE, that there had been a dinner for the union chief. Okay, so the union chief and Welch, for obviously years, had been colliding and butting heads. But the retirement dinner for the union chief went very well, and he did get his gold watch, like the old stereotype. But at the end, he stood up and he just was talking off the cuff, and he was saying what a great company GE was and how thankful he was to have worked there, that the employees were the best in the world. And right at the end, he slows up and he said, "And Mr. Welch, you had my hands for 34 years. If only you'd asked, you could have had my brain." And I think that Welch had that very abrupt, direct style, but I think that must have really hit him in thinking that, my God, am I the only brain running this massive organization? What would happen if we harnessed employee brains in a controllable way with the workout and so forth? And I think that's a major breakthrough when you start thinking, going back to the human nature. We know people are locked into status quo. That's part of human nature. You got to recognize that. And that's survival instinct. We'll accept the current, no matter how bad it is. And yet, humans accomplish great things. And the middle part is, what do leaders do that cause that transformation? And once you just take that little simple model, it's not a brand of leadership, it's just a model. Then you start thinking about all the things you can do to unleash that human potential on the other end. And so you come up with some really exciting and interesting stuff. And a lot of it is, how new is some of this stuff? Well, some of it we've done before. We just never stopped to think this is a crucial step to get to where we are, taking people from the certainty of the status quo and making the future certain for them, so to get them over.
I think what you're mentioning, Mike, becomes even more important, as before it was possible for a smart individual on top of the hierarchy to have all of the information, process that information, and therefore have the hands working for that brain, and that brain would guide what the hands should do. As we're going through this transformation where knowledge is accessible to everyone, in part because of AI, doing what you're talking about with leadership becomes even more important. It no
Oh, I
longer
agree.
is enough for one person to be able to do the thinking.
Absolutely. And it's interesting too. I think each wave of technology, I think back, I was working before we had computers. Can you imagine that? And so they bring in a computer and say, "Oh boy, this is going to save you so much time." Of course it didn't. It just sped up the gerbil wheel. And then the internet comes along. "Oh, this is going to really save you if we can adopt the internet." And Gates is banging his people to adopt the internet. And it didn't. It did. And so I polled a couple thousand people on this. How much time do you spend per day in meetings or doing emails? And I won't ask you to guess, but the average, and it doesn't matter whether they're German business people or American nonprofit, it comes out to 85% of their day is grinding away on. And so that doesn't leave a lot of time for introspection, reflection. It doesn't leave a lot of time for building relationships. And you and I know that's the name of the game. That's the magic juice that's going to get you to that. So I think that, and AI will bring its own stresses. And therefore, I think what you just said is so spot on, is that the magic ingredient to relieve some of that stress is going to be better more humane leadership approach. And I simplify by saying great leaders just get the uncertainty out of our heads and make us feel certain about the vision for the future or where we are today or what the expectations are for the boss. I'm certain of that. And that is going to be so badly needed going forward.
That's where I would love to get some of your thoughts on, Mike, in talking about certainty. I was thinking about it and smiling to myself that if anything in intelligence, uncertainty is a constant because, as I mentioned to you before, I had done some work with NGIA and some of the other parts of the agency. If anything, they deal in probabilities, not certainties. And one of the guests that I absolutely love his work, Bob Johansen, Institute for the Future, brilliant futurist, talks about how leaders should avoid certainty, however, have clarity about the future. So would love to get your thoughts on when you're talking about certainty, how does it align with the way we typically define certainty?
Gosh, there's so many ways to answer that one. It's for one thing, I used to teach an executive leadership course at DoD, and that is VUCA world, right? Volatility and uncertainty, and they're spot on in that the world is getting more that way every day. Technology's doing it to us, is getting that way. That is all external uncertainty, and what I'm talking about is deep, deep inside that employee mind. If we go in with a flashlight and look around, what do we see? You've got Kahneman's thinking fast and slow. So you've got that logical part of the brain, and we tend to assume because we can be logical, everything is logical, and therefore, if we tell people what to do, they'll do it. It doesn't work that way. The fast part of the brain is the fascinating thing, and that's full of everything. The heart. So you think the mind and heart, there's that school of leadership. It's also gut or instinct is in there. All those delicious cognitive biases that you can look up on Wikipedia are crammed in there, operating very quickly. You've got every emotion and dreams and aspirations, and you've got habitual behaviors. I've seen studies, they think it's 42% of our day we're running on habitual behavior. Don't know if it's that much, but you put all that stuff together and we're operating in fast mode for a lot. But because of that, it's very responsive and very fast, and you go negative very quickly. So UCLA's done a lot of work on something they call social pain, which is strong negative emotions. So I flew out there to see this myself. They would put somebody in a MRI scan and show them a little cartoon picture of three figures throwing a ball. And the subject pushes a lever to throw the ball to the other person. And part of the experiment is the subject is made to think that the other two stick figures are run by real people, that you have to make it. And then Matthew Lieberman, the doctor, after a couple of minutes, flips a switch and it changes the cartoon to they just throw back and forth. And you ought to see what happens in the human mind, the human brain, I should say, on the MRIs. And everything is flaring up. And then the prefrontal cortex goes dark. And then they debrief people afterwards and find out what did you experience. And different emotions. Some it's extreme jealousy. Some it's anger for being cut out. What is interesting is that whole series of looking at when does the brain go slightly haywire is because of unfairness. If you sense unfair or loss of control, autonomy, or any type of basically uncertainty that's affecting your head. So long-winded answer. So what I'm looking at is the certainty in your head and the certainty of my employee sitting there. How can I inject some sense of certainty? And we've already talked about one way is stop doing the annual review and do check-ins on a weekly basis and make them friendly and informal and under 5 minutes. And you have just wiped the slate clean of all these hidden social fears that lie there. You talked to David McCraney, right? In
Yes.
2022. And he did a beautiful job of explaining all these social pain, social tension that we've got in our head because it is a survival instinct. We need other people badly. He did just a fantastic job. So to build on that, you'd say, okay, so how can we alleviate the negative parts of that? And the way is doing check-ins. Another way is if I had my career to do over, I would give 8 times more positive feedback, Mahan, than I did. What was wrong with me? I thought my A players and my B players knew they were A players. They don't. They don't. How much would it cost me? What, 2 minutes to give 1 bit of positive feedback each week to each employee? Now, this is what happens when you do that. And Gallup's looking at this. My theory is there's about a week decay from you getting a compliment about your work. When I give you the positive feedback, you go home and you tell your spouse, guess what the boss said today? I just rung your bell. That's a definition of ringing somebody's bell. And they feel pretty good. So what happened is I answered all these questions that I found in a study. I looked at what do employees really want to know? And it's not how we're doing on revenues this month or who's visiting the plant. Is the boss happy with me? Is how well do I fit in around here? Do my colleagues respect me? It's a lot of those Q12 questions that Gallup asks. So that's what you've got. And by giving that little positive feedback or doing a check-in or asking questions that are basically show concern, like how are you feeling today? Or doing any of that injects a sense of certainty in that employee's mind. And you probably got them for about a week, and then we start drifting back. So the model is just how do you reverse engineer human nature and look at what we think is good and maybe a little negative, and then adjust the levers to fit human nature as opposed to trying to go the other way and lever against it and use accountability systems that are too negative and actually give you counterproductive results.
I love the way you describe that, Mike, in that the certainty you're talking about is not the certainty about the external world and projecting into that, which we can't do in a more uncertain VUCA world. However, because of our human emotions, there is a level of certainty we are looking for in that individual relationship, that feedback that you're talking about, including the positive feedback. The Gottmans, I'm sure you're familiar, had done a
Oh,
lot of
yeah.
research about marriages, and the positive interactions were 5-1, the marriages that ended up lasting over the years. Harvard Business Review did something similar with managers, seeing that it's almost the same ratio, 5-1, positive feedback to corrective feedback by the best managers that keeps people engaged. So what you're talking about certainty is not, I'm certain this is what's going to be happening in our company 3 years from now. Is
Yeah.
certainty, how am I doing? What do you think about me? And unfortunately, because of the 85% of the time that you said we're spending on email and meetings and everything else, the last thing we get around to is those emotional certainties we need to convey in our organizations in leading other people.
Let me talk about Gottman for just a second. This was fascinating to me. I hadn't put these two together till you said that. What he did, one of his studies was he formed a lab, of course, and films couples all day long, the interactions. And he calls it bids, where I would say, I'm working on my computer. My wife is reading the newspaper and says, oh, there's a new Thai restaurant in town. That's a bid. She gave me a bid. And then I can reject the bid by ignoring her or say I'm working. That would be a rejection. Or I could just say that, gee, we ought to give it a try sometime. And I go back to my computer. And by the way, women offer more bids than men. It's interesting. But isn't that interesting? It's a sonar for us to ping. Even I've been married for more than 5 decades. And so we ping each other throughout the day. And it's, how are you? Is everything okay? And I hadn't thought of it, I'm embarrassed to say, in terms of a certainty that we're looking for, are you still there and still with me? And how are things going?
Beautiful. I love the pinging each other. That is such an outstanding way of putting it, because that's what we are doing with our world and the people around us, most especially people we care about. We even ping people at Starbucks with a quick glance or a quick smile, let alone people whose opinions we value, including our coworkers, our bosses. So there is that constant pinging going on. Now, sometimes we're focused on our newspaper or our cell phone or the next project, and we aren't receptive to that ping. We need to be more receptive. And that's the kind of certainty you're talking about. So I
Yeah.
appreciate your clarification on that because there are these human emotions that really play a huge role. You also talk about the fight, flight, and freeze responses that we have in workplaces. And I think, Mike, for a whole host of reasons, people are experiencing a lot more of that. So, how can leaders reduce these fear based reactions in their teams?
What's interesting, I can't believe you brought that one up because I just heard another F word last week from a CIA psychologist. Are you ready for this? You got fight, flight, and freeze. And another word is flock. Like zebras, the lion is cunning. What do? They compress and they basically flock together. And so I started thinking about that. Isn't that interesting? There's another stress or fear response. And so as people are being recalled to come back to the workplace, that's a huge amount of stress because there's change. But at least the downside is maybe there could we harness that with flocking and at least find ways to pull people back together again and trigger some of the some communications and some fun and so forth in the office to offset that. Isn't that interesting? So I did to answer your question though about what can the boss do. I did a study back in started in '99 through early 2000s at CIA, and what I did very simple. I got random groups of people 20, and I would have them list every boss you've ever had at CIA, and then you rate them great, good, neutral, poor, awful. And so what I collected was not the names of the bosses, but just simply the ratings. So I had 8,000 ratings. And what's beautiful about that is, first off, you can get a quick cut of what's your leadership acumen in the organization. You got 17% great and the rest good up to 50%. And then you got 25% poor and awful. Well, so this is a good number to know. And next step, I want to know what were the bad ones like? And that was fascinating because I've got a list of 70 descriptors of bad bosses. It's amazing how many permutations and combinations you can come up with. But then I decided, okay, what about the good bosses? Because George Tenet asked me to start up a leadership academy there. And what do we teach? What do we show them? What are the proper role models? And so we got down to 200 best bosses, and it was still hard to get people to tell me the behaviors of their best boss. But when you ask the question, tell me a story about your best boss. Why was he your best? Lo and behold, they will tell a story and the behaviors are in there. And so we extracted all these behaviors and then started grouping them. How do they fit together? And we got about 6 clumps of behaviors. But the first one, are you ready for this? Now, again, this was before Amy Edmondson had done her first study on psychological safety. First thing we found was they give you a sense of safety. And I confuse people always with that because they thought safety was physical safety. Why didn't I say psychological safety like she did? But we found but this was really important. And so what were those behaviors? How hard is this? Smiling at people in the morning, saying hello, asking them how their weekend was. In certain instances, showing you value them if a little bit of empathy is appropriate. Like, how's Bobby's ankle after the soccer game? So that was, what we clustered under safety. And then what we found is, okay, after safety, you have to feel safe with somebody before you can trust them. So the next step was trust. So what are those trust building behaviors? There was an anthropologist at CIA, and we were out at the Vienna Inn. I don't think you know this place. It's a dive bar in Vienna. Sounds like a white tablecloth restaurant, Vienna Inn. And we were having beers, and I'm waxing eloquently about the foundation of leadership is trust and just spouting off left and right. And he looked at me and said, "No, Mike, you're wrong." And that's unlike him. He's a great guy. And I said, "Why?" And he said, "In psychology and sociology or anthropology, it is the law of reciprocity. And what it is, it's the consistent behavior with another person, and you're giving gifts and exchanging gifts back. It's not the gifts, it's the consistency of that behavior." And so that set us on a new area. So we looked at all those behaviors. Some bosses give gifts of data and information to people who value those gifts. Some give gifts of praise, which is a gorgeous gift to continue to give. And some would give gifts of delegating stretch jobs to people that respond to that. There's probably 20 gifts that you can give. And there's an old book called Influence Without Authority from 10, 15 years ago. Influence is like trust. It's just different direction. Influence is sideways, influencing people, and trust is up and down, but they both have currencies or gifts. So that was the second batch. So those are things that you can do to answer your question. You establish safety and you build trust. And once you've got the trust and safety, now you can go for clarity. And that was the third. And that was simple, very simple one-on-one conversations. And they could be total chit chat. It doesn't matter. And that's something Cotter discovered in his first kind of experiment he ever did. The chit chat's really important. So it could be chit chat. It could be question asking, which is still the most underutilized arrow in a leader's quiver, asking good questions. And it could be something like, again, now that we have the check-ins, I can't speak highly enough for that process. That's how you start getting the meeting of the minds. And that employee now knows, oh, now I know what the boss's expectations are. It didn't have to be written down and pasted on a board, and it didn't have to be job bullets or any of that stuff. It can just be a meeting of the minds. And if I have a question, I feel safe enough and I trust the boss enough, I can ask because I know I'm not going to be ridiculed to clarify something. So that was the stair step. And then once you get that clarity, now you can go to the fourth step, which is challenge the devil out of them. You can put the pedal to the metal because they feel safe. They trust you. There's clarity on where we're going and what we're doing. And by golly, let's go for it. To give them a challenge.
I really appreciate the clarity with which you describe these. The question is, why aren't these consistent part of our practices? So people nod, say, Mike makes perfect sense. Yes, exactly. But if you ask their teams, is this how your leader leading you or your manager managing you? The answer in vast majority of cases is no. Where is the disconnect?
Interesting because, oh gosh, we got so much to talk about on that one. For example, let's say we put people through leadership training and all this stuff is taught. And the deep, dark secret, and this has been decades and decades, is people don't practice it when they get back to the office. So why is that? That's part of your question. And I think the answer, of course, could be some of that is culture. But what's interesting about culture is we tend to talk about culture as this big thing. And it's not because, again, back to the CIA stuff, I did studies down to what we call group level. And I found there were 100 cultures inside CIA. You had places where people would do their write-in comments of, thank you so much for letting me work here. I can't wait to drive to work every morning. I can't believe I get paid. And then another one is saying, I've never thought about resigning until now. I love this. I love the CIA, but I just can't stand my boss. So what it is, and you've covered this a lot, but it is, what is that boss like? Is driving more, and I disagree with Gallup. They say it's a majority. I say it's far more than that because they say the boss drives, I don't know, 65, 70%, and then 15% is toxic environments, yada, yada. The boss creates the toxic.
Yes.
So I say it's all about the boss. So if you really wanted to change an organization, you go back to that that little profile. I said off the cuff, I said 25% poor and awful bosses. Let's say that's your profile. Well, that doesn't sound bad. We can live with that. But now think about, let's take a hierarchy, org chart, and what we're going to do is our managers will turn over every 2 years. What does that do internally with that 25%, those poor and awful managers? This is where it gets interesting because this was years ago, a group downtown DC that Gardner bought out did a study, and they found that if you've got a very toxic boss in an organization and you move, that organization is disabled for up to 5 years after the boss leaves. Now, why? He created a microculture of fear. And so think about that. There's this residual. So I built this model. I just paid out of pocket myself and got with a statistician, built a model of CIA or any other organization, put in the number of levels, good, bad bosses, turnover rate, the lag factor of what happens when that bad boss goes from this group to that group. And in 4 years, he goes to another. He's now polluted 3 of those organizations. And so have a huge, disproportionate amount of impact on the organization. So, okay, so long-winded answer. What should they do to have the most impact? I would say this. Stop saying my key job is developing future leaders. Stop it. Just stop saying it. Your key job is choosing the future leaders in the first place and using scientific selection to choose those people. Then your job is developing, but get that development, push it down to second place. And I got a good one for this. You can use this for cocktail chatter. Do you know who invented psychological assessments?
No.
Okay, you ready for this? The CIA, 1943, it was called the OSS, and they were dropping people into France, teams, Jedburgh teams, and they were having a lot of problem with everything from what they called nervous breakdowns to bad leadership and teams falling apart, and people were getting killed with this. The psychologist at OSS in August of 43 went to General Donovan and knocked on his door, and Chief, we think if we leave our Jungian and Freudian baggage at the door, that we could come up with a way to assess people scientifically and predict their future behavior. They say, won't be perfect, but it's going to be so much better than what we're using now. So he said, go for it. They went to the farm 3 weeks later, 4 days, they hammered all this out. 3 weeks after that, they went to a place called Fairfax Circle down near here and rented an old estate and ran the first OSS class through. Now, top secret, same time the Brits were working on this. Just imagine what a leg up you've got in warfare if you've got good leaders and you can inspire people to do superhuman things. And the Germans were working on it. And the Germans and Brits failed. And the Americans, because I think we were more egalitarian, so we could figure a poor person could have leadership skills. And so in 1948, they published a book. And I think it's one of the 5 biggest discoveries in psychology that century. And today you've got the Gallup does this, Talent Plus, you got companies that do this, but too few companies like Ritz-Carlton take advantage of this and discover what are leadership attributes. And it's not to preclude people, but for goodness sakes, just filter out that bottom 25%. Get rid of the psychopaths, the near psychopaths, the autocrats, the narcissists. And my model shows, who knows, this is not a scientific study. My model shows if you can get down to 8% poor and awful bosses, your organization can fly. And it's because of that pollution effect of having the bad ones. They affect culture and this, that, and the other. So imagine everybody having that boss where I said, I love driving to work in the morning because I can't wait to start the task at hand. And I love working here. And it's back to the old engagement numbers from Gallup. It's just that suddenly you've done more to engage employees than all the training in the world is going to get you.
It makes a huge difference, Mike, and I couldn't agree with you more. In all the years of my work with companies across the globe, whether when I was at Dale Carnegie or as I have been doing consulting work, people talk about organizational culture. To your point, there are very few organizations that have a culture. They might talk about a culture, even Amazon, which has its leadership principles, and everyone knows those leadership principles. Any two teams can be drastically different in their culture, in part because of the person who is leading that specific team. And therefore, going back to Jim Collins's words and analogy, get the right people on the bus
There you
and
go.
get the right people on the right seats on the bus becomes really important, more so than all the training in the world. I am a big believer in training. I spent many years in training and development, but you do need to have some of the right characteristics.
And I'll give you a solution to that problem on the development side. Again, just what is human nature? Let's reverse engineer it. So, how could we actually get people to apply what we teach? And I just did an experiment at a group called CISA in December, this a couple months ago. CISA is the Cyber and Infrastructure Security Agency. And what we did was recognize we can design world-class training. This is really good stuff. And it's a lot of what you and I have been talking about. It's a lot of what's in the book and so forth. But that's not good enough because what I found over the years is people will go out and they'll pick one thing and they're able to apply it. And the reason is we're coming crashing into, it's not really the culture that stops them because they have their little microcultures. It's really habitual behavior that stops them, right? And of all the literature I've read on changing your habits, I find it very unsatisfying because there's no magic wand. Duhigg, who you've interviewed, and Atomic Secrets, and it's really a grind because habit has such a hold over us. I started thinking about, okay, if habit is the problem, how could we come up with something I call habitual process where, and I got this idea, oddly enough, from Welch when he was doing Six Sigma stuff. He would school us up till we were black belts and we use these tools. And now we're working on a project to improve a process. We're doing a lot of really, applying a lot of really good leadership things, asking questions and pulling out ideas from people and so forth. So I thought, okay, what would we like them to do? Wouldn't it be great if they would just smile? Let's go back to that first step on the, okay, if we get them to go back and they smile at their employees and they have one-on-one conversations, and what if they could even ask questions? Wouldn't that be great? And so it dawned on me, and now I'm going to go back to the check-in. The check-in is I call it a behavioral process because it includes lots of good little leadership steps. So what if we could get them to do check-ins? We're dragging along a lot of other behaviors. And okay, so now you're saying habitual behavior will stop them. Of course it will. But now what you do is you come up with what I call a soft accountability, which is I went to the leadership at CISA and I said, look, here's a list of, I think I gave them 15 ways that you can put accountability for them to do check-ins. And the easiest was simply, what if you make them do a weekly report with 4 bullets? And the 4 bullets are, what did I learn about myself doing check-ins? Or what did I learn about my people doing check-ins? That's the extent of the report. And it's just sentences, right? So it's not burdensome. And then after 90 days, what we're going to do is we're going to destroy the report. It goes away. Why? Because it's a bureaucratic burden to do reports. But what we've done is we've created habitual behavior for them to do check-ins. And we make them announce to the employees when they get back, hey, I just want everybody to know I'm going to start doing weekly check-ins with you guys, see how you're doing and see how I can help. And so by doing the public pronouncement and then having report driving them out of their mind for 90 days, you're getting the accountability in for the behavioral process to drag along those. So that to me is the secret.
You just gave everyone one of the most effective ways to drive engagement and change within the organization, which is making sure there is no ifs, ands, or buts in my view. There is no canceling and saying, how about once a month, once a quarter, once every 6 months? Making sure that on a weekly basis, there's a regular cadence of those check ins, one
Hmm.
on ones, which makes it easier. Most of us are human enough to want to know how the other person is doing, are
Exactly.
human enough to want to engage. It's just that we are so busy running around that we don't take the time to do it. So when you systematize the check in process and make it part of people's habits, it's unbelievable the impact it has on engagement, on coaching. So all of those things can come in addition to that. Now, I feel like, Mike, you and I can go on for hours.
I'm just starting to roll.
I love it. So many tangible insights on things that can actually make a difference. Where can the audience find out more about your book, follow your work and your writing?
So I do have a book site. Certainty is the name of the book. How great bosses can change minds, meaning change behaviors. And it turns out it's something called the insight mechanism, which is key to that, and drive innovation. And it's just all of the things we've talked about. So if they look up Certainty, it's on Amazon, be ordered through any of the bookstores, and it's in all the Borders ebooks and so forth. So it's out there.
Really appreciate that, Mike. Having worked with some incredible people in the federal government, including at the CIA, NGIA, there are hundreds of committed people, some of the most committed people I have known, who have dedicated their lives to serving others. So I appreciate you having served and now serving through communicating how we can become better, more impactful leaders. Thank you so much for the conversation, Mike Mears.
Thank you so much, Mahan. It's been wonderful.